I think I'll go ahead and start. First of all, I'll welcome everybody. We may have some more people joining us in a bit. First of all, I want to say happy birthday to Chris Rash. There she is smiling at us. And Chris is 81 today, I think, but she doesn't look a day over 40. And her husband next to her had his birthday. Was it yesterday, I think? Yep. And he's old enough to be able to get every senior discount there is offered. But just in good jest, good board members and good friends. So happy birthday to you both.
Good to both.
By the way, the next month, and we'll bring this up again, is the Great Backyard Bird Count. Will be February 17th to the 20th. There'll probably be something in our next newsletter about that, but if you want to prepare for that weekend, think about it. From January 15th to February 15th, we'll be running our Climate Watch bluebird surveys again. We've been doing that since 2007. And Francis and I had some bluebirds on a Christmas bird count in Elkader, Elkader in somebody's yard. They had 4 of them here over the last week. So there's some around. If somebody wants to be involved in one of the bird counts, you can let us know through the website. Or if you want to start your own, we just do bluebirds. They also have routes that can be set up for nuthatches, for towhees. But right now we're just set up to do bluebirds. So we're looking at replacing the bluebird boxes at George Wythe. There's been and with some predator proof bluebird boxes. There's been an issue with predators on those the last couple of years where something's been getting in there and destroying the young and the eggs. They need to be replaced, and we can do it either by buying those or having somebody make one or make 5 or 6 of them. So if that's something you might be interested in helping with, if you have you're a woodworker or so who would like to do that, let us know. But that's a project we're going to take on and take care of. Our grant applications for Audubon are out right now to our 6 counties, to the conservation boards there and nature centers. And those are due March 15th promptly. No late ones this year, March 15th, and then we'll decide. I think we allotted at least $4,000 for those grants to go for conservation projects and education. We just completed a work on one of our goals with our trails in the area, the bicycle trails, the hard trails, putting points, hot spots. There's about 15 of them in Waterloo and Cedar Falls, off the bike trails that are good places to stop to look for birds and other wildlife. There's a revised version of the trails for the Cedar Valley will be printed by the end of the month. And they have little, I didn't bring it with me, a little business card that has a QR code on it that you can put on your phone, scan it, and it'll take you to the virtual map, and which has different layers, like where the restrooms are, where parking areas are, where all the trails are through the area. And then also a layer with the birding hotspot points that are on there. We have a stack of those. We were the first to get them that we'll have available at our next meeting, or that you can put in your wallet and check this out. It's a pretty neat map. Or you can pick those up at the Cedar Falls Visitor Center and other areas as they get distributed. See, if you have questions or comments, you can free to use the chat room on our Zoom. Next month, we'll be back in live meetings again at the Cedar Falls at the First Presbyterian Church on Main Street. And our speaker will be Kelly McKay, who has the national record for the most number of Christmas bird counts ever done. And he's a wonderful birder and presenter, and he'll be teaching us about the details on how to identify waterfowl. And we're planning on right now on being able to do that meeting not only live and in person, but also if you can't, you're away, far away, or unable to drive or don't want to at night, or got another meeting or something going on. We're going to be offering that not only recorded, but a live Zoom. So we're working on that to be able to do that for this next month and for the remainder of the year. That'll be pretty cool if we can get that up and working. Francis has a comment about a possible birding trip to Zach-Zim Bog in Minnesota. Francis, take it away, buddy.
Yes, I got a email from Tyler Harms, who is the person in charge of the Iowa Young Birders group. I'd signed up to go to Zach-Zim with them, but he still needs a few more people to make the trip. So if anybody's interested, I think the trip is $75. That's for snacks and water and stuff. But pretty much you have to get to Duluth on your own. And he just needs, I don't know how many a few is, but a few more people to go up. It's February 3rd, 4th, and 5th to go to Duluth, and then they'll go up into the bog from there.
Thank you. That's a premier birding spot, especially in the winter in the United States. You can see a lot of really interesting birds up there come down from Canada. And I think that $75 fee is you're on a bus with everybody, and they take you to the different hot spots in that area, some feeders and other things. So we may get an email or something out on that too.
You can go to the Iowa Young Birders website and find details there.
Oh, there. Thank you, Francis. And I want to thank everybody end of the year for your end of 2022 for your donations and memberships. They do make a difference for what we do here locally. Your money stays here. We really, really appreciate it. And we appreciate you all being here for this presentation we're all looking forward to today on what we can do to help trumpet or whooping cranes. I got off thinking about trumpeter swans we've all been seeing today. But so Stephanie Schmidt, our presenter tonight, is a fellow cheesehead from Wisconsin. We were both born and raised there, I think. Mm-hmm. And she has got her BS degree in zoology and environmental studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and a master's degree in natural resources and environmental sciences from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And she is the Whooping Crane Outreach Coordinator for the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which I understand has undergone a major reconstruction effort that she'll tell us about too, I think, later. And it's a great place to visit. And she is a whooping crane enthusiast, amongst many other things. So we're very excited to have her all the way from Wisconsin near Baraboo. And so welcome, Stephanie. We're looking forward to your program.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to get my program pulled up here in just one moment. Oops, I actually need to share sound. All right. And you should see my presentation. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Perfect. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here to talk about whooping cranes in the eastern migratory population. Like Tom said, my name is Stephanie Schmidt. I'm the Whooping Crane Outreach Coordinator at the International Crane Foundation. And in this presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the International Crane Foundation, give you kind of an idea of who we are, what is some of the work that we're doing to protect whooping cranes, and also the other 14 species of cranes that we work with. He'll then introduce you to all 14 species, talk about kind of what makes a bird a crane and some of those similar features between them and where they're found, focusing then in on our whooping crane. And I'll give you some tips, tricks, and pointers on how to identify these birds out in the field by sight and by sound. And then I'll really dive into their history, talk about some of our reintroduction efforts and the work that we're doing to bring whooping cranes back to the North American landscape, talk about some threats that they continue to face and ways that you can actively get involved in helping to protect whooping cranes in your own community. So to start out, the International Crane Foundation is headquartered in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and is located within the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. As an organization, we acknowledge and honor the Ho-Chunk people as caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial, and as our neighbors, friends, and vital members of our community. The International Crane Foundation is dedicated to amplifying local voice and perspective in all of the places where cranes dance. All right, and pictured here are our two co-founders. So the International Crane Foundation was an idea that was first born in 1971 of two Cornell University graduate students. We have Dr. George Archibald, who is pictured here in white, and we have Dr. Ron Sowie pictured there in red. So Ron Sowie and George Archibald, they envisioned an organization that would combine research, captive breeding and reintroduction, landscape restoration and education, with the ultimate goal being to safeguard the world's 15 species of cranes. And in 1973, the International Crane Foundation was hatched in Baraboo, Wisconsin, on the old Sowie family horse farm. Since 1973, the International Crane Foundation has really grown from being just an idea to so much more. And today, the mission of the International Crane Foundation, also called ICF, is to work worldwide to conserve cranes and the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. And you can see here where we're doing work to protect all 15 species of cranes. This shows you where these cranes are found, some of their flyways, their breeding habitats, and their wintering areas. And you can see that cranes really are found all around the world. Cranes are going to be found on 5 out of 7 continents. The only spaces you're not going to find cranes is South America and Antarctica. But by looking at this map, you can really see how truly international in scope our work is, and in a sense, really how unifying it is as well, because we do need to form partnerships around the world in order to safeguard the future of all 15 species of cranes and all of the places that they use. So while the International Crane Foundation is headquartered in Baraboo, Wisconsin, we do have offices and staff in China, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, and South Africa. And here in the United States, we have staff across more than 7 states. And today, the International Crane Foundation is working to achieve that mission of protecting all 15 species of cranes under our current leadership, Dr. George Archibald, Dr. Rich Balfus, and Kim Smith. And we're focused on achieving 7 key strategies. And those are resolving threats to cranes, ensuring healthy landscapes, bringing people together, improving livelihoods, empowering future leaders, being action based on science, and restoring cranes to the wild. And every year, the International Crane Foundation does work around the globe to address these 7 key strategies and again, safeguard the future of those 15 species of cranes. But as today's theme is going to be whooping cranes, especially in the Eastern migratory population, I want to share with you some of our conservation highlights and the work that we were able to achieve to protect whooping cranes in 2021. So the first thing that we were able to do was remove over 1,200 abandoned crab traps and free 567 live crabs in coastal Texas bays, which assured a valuable food source was available for our wintering whooping cranes. We also engaged with 14 private land managers who oversee 177 square miles of existing and future whooping crane habitat along the Texas coast. And we engaged with them about options for conservation and restoration that are going to benefit our cranes and other wildlife. We conducted virtual education programs to teach students about the plight of whooping cranes in the EMP in 27 educational institutions to reach over 1,100 students. We taught health management for whooping crane recovery to 60 Wisconsin college students for the 20th straight year. We deployed 5 transmitters and collected over 24,000 data points on our breeding adult whooping cranes to understand their movements and habitat use here in the Midwest. And we located 26 whooping crane nests to deploy 14 nest cameras and track 18 wild hatch chicks as part of our whooping crane monitoring program for the reintroduced eastern migratory population. So that is just work that we did with whooping cranes in the past year, and we're doing work similar to that for all 15 species of cranes all around the world. And that's what we have pictured here are those 15 species of cranes that we work with. And you can see by looking at these birds, some of those similar features that they have. So all cranes are going to have very long beaks, small heads, and long necks. And with those sorts of lengthening features, you can probably gather that these birds are relatively tall as well. And a lot of that height is coming from their incredibly long legs, which allows them to wade through their wetland environments. The tallest of all 15 species of cranes that we work with is going to be our Saurus crane. They stand at 6 feet tall, and they can be found in places like India and Australia. The shortest of all 15 species of cranes is actually going to be our demoiselle crane. They stand at about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, but despite being the shortest species of crane, they do have one of the most impressive migrations, as they're actually going to fly over the Himalayas on their migration, just a few thousand feet below that of an airplane. You can also see by looking at our cranes that there's a lot of repetition of color. A lot of them are going to have either black, white, red, or gray on their face or on their neck. There's only one crane species that doesn't have that same color palette, and that's going to be our blue crane, also called the Stanley crane, and they're actually the national bird of South Africa. But bringing it back in locally, there are 2 species of cranes that you may encounter in Iowa, and that's going to be our sandhill crane and our whooping crane. The sandhill crane is one of the most common species of crane found around the world. There's about 800,000 of them in all of North America. And in your area, you can expect to see about 20,000 sandhill cranes making their way through along the Mississippi River. On the very opposite end of the spectrum is going to be one of the rarest and most endangered species of crane in all of the world, and that's going to be our whooping crane. And that'll be the one that we're going to talk about today. But I do want to say being listed as threatened or even endangered, like our whooping crane, is not uncommon for cranes. 10 out of the 15 species that we do work with are listed as threatened or endangered, and they're really facing various threats, ultimately due to habitat loss. All of them are dependent on wetlands to some degree, with wetlands being one of the most threatened habitats around the world. It stands to reason that these very wetland dependent birds are going to be impacted by that. They're also threatened by the illegal pet trade in some instances, and poaching and other factors too. And we'll talk about some of those that are impacting our whooping cranes. But before we talk about their history and some of the work we're doing with them, I do want to formally introduce you to the whooping crane, and their Latin name is Grus americana. And when talking about the whooping crane, it's really important to talk about what they sound like before talking about what they look like. For whooping cranes, they get their common name because of this very distinct whooping-like call that they make. Another thing to note about whooping cranes is that call can carry for miles. So oftentimes you're going to hear a whooping crane long before you see one. And I have 2 distinct calls that I want to play for you from our whooping crane today. And the first one is going to be a guard call. In this call, you're going to hear sort of a single note shout, followed by another bird responding with that single note shout. And this is seen as kind of an alarm, or when a whooping crane is trying to warn their partner of danger, or when they're alarmed that they see somebody who might be looking at them when they're out birding. So this is a call you might see, or you might hear when you spot a whooping crane. And I'll play that one for you now. And our next call is a little bit different. This is a unison call. So in this call, you're going to hear 2 birds that are calling at the same time in kind of an overlapping cacophony of sounds. This call, the unison call, is most often done in breeding territory, so that'll be a little bit further north of you. And it's usually done between a bonded pair, often after copulating or after defending their territory. It's a very loud, raucous call, but it's very distinct for the whooping crane. So I will play that one now. So whooping cranes also have some very distinct physical features. They stand at 5 feet tall, and this makes them the tallest bird in all of North America. And a lot of that height is going to come from those skinny, long black legs. Looking at their body, you'll see that it's this brilliant white color coming all the way up through their body and through their long neck. On the top of their head, they're going to have a featherless red patch on the crown of their head, a black mustache-like mask on their cheeks, a bright yellow eye, and a grayish yellow beak. When they're in flight, you'll see that they're always going to fly with that long neck outstretched in front of them and those long black legs trailing behind them. They have an impressive 7 to 8 foot wingspan. And at the very tips of their wings, you'll see that they have these prominent black wingtips. So for large white birds like the whooping crane, it's really advantageous to have these darker feathers on the tips of their wings, because when you're flying on migration, the feathers that undergo the most wear and tear or breakage are going to be those at the very tips of your wings. And as we know, white feathers don't have any melanin in them, so they're not as strong, but the more melanin you have in there, the darker the feathers, the stronger that feather is. Unfortunately, that does mean that there are some other large white birds out in the landscape that also have these prominent black wingtips, which can make it a little bit more difficult to identify whooping cranes. And I have some of those birds pictured here. So birds like the great egret and the great blue heron, while they don't have black wingtips, they do look similar to whooping cranes in that they're long-necked, long-legged wading birds found in wetlands. But in flight, they're always going to fly with that neck coiled into an S, whereas our cranes hold that neck outstretched in front of them. But then we have other birds like the American white pelican and the snow goose here that don't look very similar to whooping cranes on land, but can be mistaken for them in flight. The bird that I often see is most commonly mistaken for a whooping crane is going to be the American white pelican. And one important thing to note is that both of these birds fly relatively high up in the sky, and the higher up you are for a crane, the harder it is for us to see that long neck and those long legs trailing. So at that point, we're really just relying on the body and the wings to identify this bird. So one way that I tell them apart is that our whooping cranes are going to have black just at the very tips of their wings, whereas our pelicans have black on the tip and then coming all the way along the underside of their wings there too. Another bird that's oftentimes mistaken for our whooping cranes is going to be our sandhill cranes. Here in the Midwest, we see both of these species. They're often spending time together in mixed flocks. They share a lot of similar features, so much so that sometimes we even call them cousins because they are so closely related. When looking at these two birds, we have our sandhill crane on the top and our whooping crane on the bottom. There are some distinct features to note to tell them apart. The first thing being that whooping cranes are bigger than sandhill cranes. They're about an entire foot taller than sandhill cranes. They're a little bit heavier than them too. And they're both going to have red on their head. But while our whooping cranes have a black mustache, our sandhill cranes have kind of a white cheek. You'll also see when looking at the sandhill crane that they have kind of a brown and gray throughout their entire body and wings. So it's a little bit easier to see how that sandhill crane looks different than our whooping crane right here. But it becomes a little bit more difficult when you have juvenile whooping cranes out in the landscape. And that's the one that we have pictured in the middle here, right between these two adults. So you can see this juvenile whooping crane. This is one that's maybe about 4 to 5 months old, about to head out, leave Wisconsin and go on its fall migration. And this bird is a few months old, but it's going to be 5 feet tall, just like its parents. And instead of having white on its body, it's going to have white kind of mixed with cinnamon feathers coming up through its body, cinnamon color on its neck and its head. It's going to have a blue eye instead of that yellow eye, and kind of a pink gray beak and legs. So you can see here how this bird may look just a little bit more similar to that of a sandhill crane, and even closer to that of a juvenile sandhill crane, which also carries some of these cinnamon colorations as well. And I do want to note these features of this juvenile whooping crane, especially for this audience here, because the whooping cranes that we're seeing make their way through Iowa each year are most often those that are going to be juveniles. So you do want to make sure that you understand what a juvenile whooping crane looks like as well as an adult, because you can see both of them making their way through Iowa. So let's talk a little bit about the history of whooping cranes now, starting with their historic range. So pre-European expansion, whooping cranes would have had a massive range. It was anticipated that there were over 10,000 whooping cranes in the fertile wetlands and prairies of North America, and their range would have expanded as far north as the Arctic, coming all the way through the upper Midwest. You can see right here in northern Iowa, we would have expected to see breeding whooping cranes. They then would have migrated through the bulk of North America and then spent their winters in places like central Mexico and coastal Gulf of Mexico. Right away, this tells me one thing, and that's that whooping cranes had a massive range, but also that whooping cranes were never one of the most numerous species out in the landscape. When you think about those historic estimates of 10,000 whooping cranes, that is much smaller than the current estimates of sandhill cranes we have, which is again around 800,000. But by the 1940s, whooping cranes did face near extinction when there were only 20 individuals left in the wild. And you may be wondering, well, what contributed to this decline of whooping cranes? And unfortunately, there were many, many factors that contributed to the decline of whooping cranes. The first of which is going to be unregulated hunting, as you can see from this picture of a man that's recently shot a whooping crane that he has on display. And right above that whooping crane, we see 2 sandhill cranes as well. So unfortunately, when European settlers moved into these spaces, these fertile wetlands and prairies that whooping cranes were using, the area was lush with resources, but game laws were mostly ignored and rarely enforced. And what happened was this led to unrestrained hunting and destruction of wild areas that ultimately grew into the 1800s and led to the extinction of some species we could have seen today. Unfortunately, as whooping cranes became scarce on the landscape as a result of this unregulated hunting, we saw that the value of whooping cranes increased. And with that, we saw further increases in hunting of whooping cranes, as well as egg collecting. So taking eggs off of their nests simply for the value of them. And this has incredibly detrimental impacts on whooping cranes simply because of their life history. And when talking about the life history of whooping cranes, it's important to note applies to all 15 species of cranes, and really is another factor impacting why so many of them are threatened and endangered. So the first thing to know about whooping cranes, or really cranes in general, is they're an incredibly long-lived species. In the wild, whooping cranes can live into their mid-20s, maybe even their 30s, and in captivity, they can live to be much older. At the International Crane Foundation, we once cared for a Siberian crane. His name was Wolf, and he lived to be 83 years old. So on top of being an incredibly long-lived species, they're also very slow to reproduce. They typically don't start reproducing until they're about 3 to 5 years old. They're going to find one individual who they'll mate with, presumably for life, and they'll start reproducing around that time, but they don't typically successfully hatch or fledge a chick until they've been with that mate for a couple of years at that point. On top of that, these birds are only laying about 1 to 2 eggs each year, oftentimes just hatching and raising 1 chick each year. So individuals with these sorts of life history traits, being very long-lived, slow to reproduce, and laying very small clutches, they're often greatly impacted by losses to their population, and it's hard for them to rebuild following those losses. Unfortunately, there were additional factors at play. Another one includes the millinery trade, and this is essentially the trade for wild bird feathers, which at this time are used to adorn women's hats for fashion. And some of the most sought after bird feathers were those of very colorful birds, or those of very large white birds like our whooping crane that could make the plume like the one that's pictured on this woman's hat right here. But luckily for whooping cranes and the many birds that we still see today, some high society women from Boston, they noticed this issue and they formed the first Audubon Society, which essentially banned the trade of wild bird feathers and protected the birds that we still see today. Finally, another massive contributor to the decline of whooping cranes was habitat loss. And this habitat loss was largely driven by the Homestead Act of the 1860s. And this act encouraged people to rapidly move out west, and in doing so, convert hundreds of thousands of acres, that fertile wetland habitat that our birds depended on, into the predominantly agricultural landscape that we see today, which took away a valuable resource, not just for whooping cranes, but many other wetland-dependent species. So as you know, historically, Iowa would have looked very different than it does today. And as we know from looking at the map of whooping cranes, historically, northern Iowa would have been a breeding territory for whooping cranes in North America. So we would have seen a state that would have been filled with fertile prairies and wetlands that would have been hospitable to our cranes. But since the 1800s, Iowa has lost over 89% of its historic wetlands. And as you can see from this map here, many other Midwestern states that our cranes use, places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana, have been similarly impacted. And much of this wetland loss is driven by land conversion to agriculture, urbanization, and pollution. But when people began to notice not only the decline of whooping cranes, but the loss of some more common birds in wild spaces, it resulted in a series of laws to protect whooping cranes and protect some of those key wetland habitats. And the first law that we see is in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This is incredibly important for whooping cranes because it protected them from the illegal take. So taking of their feathers, taking of their eggs, their nests, the birds themselves, those big things that impacted whooping cranes early on. Then we saw the passage of the duck stamp in 1934. And if you're familiar with wetlands or a waterfowl hunter yourself, you might be familiar with the Duck Stamp Act, which is a large art competition to design these stamps, which are sold to hunters to hunt on federal lands, and that money is recirculated right back into conservation. It still exists today, and it's raised over $850 million to protect 6.5 million acres of wildlife habitat. In 1966, we saw the creation of the refuge system. And this is incredibly important for our whooping cranes because these are large birds and they are territorial birds. So they do need these expansive wetland habitats in order to have the appropriate habitat or territory size in order to build their nests, defend their territory, raise their chicks. When we're talking about whooping cranes and their territory size, we're talking about 1,000 acres per pair. So they really do need this refuge system or these large wetland complexes in order to effectively breed. In 1972, of course, we saw the passage of the Clean Water Act. This is important because it revolutionized the protection and restoration of aquatic habitats like the wetlands our whooping cranes depend on. But finally, in 1973, we saw the passage of the Endangered Species Act. At this time, there were only 70 whooping cranes living out in the wild, and they were immediately listed as endangered. They were actually listed as endangered right before the act passed, and they were grandfathered in, but whooping cranes are still listed as endangered today. And that's because none of the populations that we work with are at the point of being self-sustaining or at the point where they can continue to survive and grow without the reintroduction of birds out into the populations or a pretty heavy hand in the management and monitoring of this species. So today, whooping cranes exist across 4 distinct populations. The first of which is our historic population. This is the one that used to span all of North America and has since been reduced to a single flyway. This is known as the Aransas wood buffalo population, as these birds will breed in Canada at Wood Buffalo National Park, fly through the Central Flyway on their migration, and then they're going to winter at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in coastal Texas. In the 1990s, the International Crane Foundation and our partners reintroduced our first non-migratory flock of whooping cranes in Florida. And in 2011, we reintroduced a second non-migratory flock in Louisiana. And right in between these two, in 2001, we reintroduced the Eastern migratory population. And that's the one that's circled there in brown. And it's going to be the focus for the remainder of the talk, is that's the one that makes their way through your area each year. So the Eastern migratory population, or again, the EMP, it was a collaborative effort to reintroduce whooping cranes in Wisconsin that are going to migrate to and from Florida. Today, we're not seeing that population go nearly as far south as Florida to winter, and instead they're going to be spending their winters in places like northern Alabama and western Indiana. They do still return to Wisconsin each year to breed and nest, but some have started to spend their summers in places like Michigan or in Minnesota, and we are increasingly seeing whooping cranes that will migrate through eastern Iowa on their flight north as well. So I do want to share with you a little bit more about the Eastern migratory population and kind of go in depth about the whooping crane reintroduction program. So the Eastern United States didn't see whooping cranes for many years. It wasn't until 2001 again that they were reintroduced to this Eastern flyway. So the International Crane Foundation and Crane Conservation Partners, they've worked to reintroduce whooping cranes to the Eastern United States through a captive rearing and release program that uses some of the following practices. And it's important to note that this program is still in use, as this Eastern migratory population is not self-sustaining. So again, it's not going to grow or continue to thrive if we don't continue to put individuals out into that population and have a heavy hand in the management and monitoring of these birds. And I want to share with you a little bit about these reintroduction efforts, but I'm going to break it down into 3 steps, starting first with eggs, then talking about chicks, and then finally their release. So step 1 is eggs. And there are many steps to the process of reintroducing a whooping crane for the wild, but for simplicity's sake, the first step is really getting these eggs to hatch chicks. And we can ultimately do that in one of 2 ways. The first way is the most simple way. This is by breeding our captive birds. And we do this through artificial insemination, with the main goal being to increase genetic diversity for healthy wild populations. When we're talking about whooping cranes, we're talking about a population that dropped to 20. That's a pretty severe genetic bottleneck. There's not a lot of diversity within this population. There's always going to be some level of inbreeding, but by controlling breeding and increasing the diversity of individuals breeding with each other, we're able to introduce that diversity and have a healthier population. After these birds are bred, they're then going to lay eggs. Those eggs are incubated for around 30 days until they hatch a chick. The second method that we use is something that is called double clutching. And in this method, we essentially collect eggs off of wild whooping crane nests and we incubate them and we hatch them in captivity. This is used as a management method in a breeding area in Wisconsin known as Necedah National Wildlife Refuge. And we use this method here because at Necedah each year, right when our whooping cranes are nesting, there's a very short-lived black fly outbreak. And these black flies, they're going to bite our incubating birds, harass them while they're nesting, and make it very difficult for these birds to continue to sit on their eggs. They may end up undergoing a lot of stress and abandon their eggs. But by doing double clutching, we come in right as the flies come out, we pull the eggs off of the nest. This relieves the birds of incubation duties, and they can wander around and better escape the flies. These eggs are able to hatch in captivity, and then the birds that live out in the wild, they can breed again, build a nest, lay eggs, and hatch right after those black flies die down. So in this way, we're able to hatch chicks both in the wild and in captivity to be released out into the wild each year to help this population grow. And I have pictured here what some of our incubators look like at the International Crane Foundation. So this is where we're going to put those eggs that are brought in from the wild. And they have the same humidity and temperature and conditions of an incubating egg. So they're able to hatch in this environment here. But on my next slide here, I do have a time-lapse video of what a whooping crane chick hatching at the International Crane Foundation looks like. And I will play that for you now. All right, so once those chicks are hatched at the International Crane Foundation, we then can raise the chicks using one of two methods. The first method is the most obvious, most natural. This is parent rearing. And this is where we have adult whooping cranes that live at the International Crane Foundation. They hatch the eggs, they raise the chicks, teach them everything they need to know about how to survive in the wild, and then they're released out into the wild. But oftentimes at the International Crane Foundation, as a result of our breeding of our birds and also that double clutching, we're oftentimes hatching and raising more chicks in captivity than we have adults that are able to raise them. And this is where we rely on our second method, and this method is known as costume rearing. And pictured here, I have the costumes that raise whooping cranes at the International Crane Foundation. And at first glance of this costume, you might think it looks a little bit ridiculous. But when you break down the anatomy of these costumes, you can see how it looks a little bit like a whooping crane. And that's important because whooping cranes have this very unique trait in which they imprint. So imprinting is that rapid learning process where a young bird learns who they are by looking at who is raising it. So if you raise a whooping crane, looking, sounding, acting, talking like a human being, unfortunately, that whooping crane isn't going to learn its identity to be that of a whooping crane. Once it's released out in the wild, it's not going to make safe decisions out in the wild. It's not going to want to spend time with other whooping cranes. And once it reaches its breeding age, it's not going to want to breed with other whooping cranes. So it's not going to help the population grow either. So it's incredibly important that our whooping cranes know that they are whooping cranes. We do that by using these costumes. So breaking down the anatomy, you can see we have a person that's wearing the costume. That gives us the height of the whooping crane. Then they're covered in white, which gives us that large white body. Your left arm is going to act as your whooping crane wing. So it'll be tucked most of the time, but when you're running around and flapping your wing, you can pop that out and show those prominent black wingtips. Your right arm is then going to act as your neck. So you see that long white neck. And at the top, we have a puppet head that has a featherless red patch on the crown of their head, a black mustache-like mask on their cheeks, bright yellow eye, and a grayish yellow beak. Our biologists who wear these costumes, they'll spend a lot of time mimicking whooping crane behaviors, so doing things like preening their feathers, foraging on the ground for food, drinking water, staying alert, or even running around and flapping their wings to teach these young birds how to fly. Finally, it's important that you not only look like a whooping crane and act like a whooping crane, but you also need to sound like a whooping crane. So our biologists who wear these costumes, they have a small tape recorder that's going to play this contact call of a whooping crane. And this is a very soft kind of purring sound. And this is a sound that an adult whooping crane would make when they're trying to communicate with their chick. They'll even make this sound when they're talking to their chick in the egg. So we actually can't even talk around the eggs when we're working with them too. but I'll play this call for you now. But I do want to note it is relatively quiet. It just sounds kind of like a purring sound. So when looking at these costumes, again, you may think that sounds pretty ridiculous to wear these costumes, especially because we have all 15 species of cranes at the International Crane Foundation. Why aren't we just putting these eggs under one of those other birds that can hatch those chicks and raise them? And that actually takes us all the way back to 1975 to the Rocky Mountain experimental flock. So this flock was created when whooping crane eggs were placed on sandhill crane nests at Gray's Lake in Idaho to be raised or cross-fostered by sandhill cranes, and then taught a migration route down to Bosque del Apache. However, as the whooping crane eggs hatched in this population and these sandhill cranes raised these whooping cranes, it became pretty apparent that these whooping cranes had imprinted on the sandhill cranes, and they only wanted to spend time with other sandhill cranes, and they only wanted to breed with other sandhill cranes, which is a huge problem for the recovery of a species. This program was officially discontinued in 1989, and the last whooping crane in this population was gone in 2002, but we did learn a valuable lesson about these methods, being that a whooping crane, or something that looks exactly like a whooping crane, really is needed to raise these whooping cranes for them to correctly learn their identity. So this finally takes us to our final step in our whooping crane reintroductions, and this is releasing the fledglings out into the wild. So from 2001, when this population was created, until 2016, we released birds out into the population through ultralight flight, something that was called Operation Migration. And this was actually how we created our migratory routes. This path that these birds migrate on in the eastern migratory population was completely created by scientists. And these birds were taught their migration path because we had somebody who wore a costume actually fly this ultralight airplane and guide these birds down in their migration, making regular stops all the way down in the fall, and then picking them back up in the spring to fly back up with them to Wisconsin. We did officially discontinue Operation Migration in 2016 because we found that we had enough whooping cranes out in the wild that we can now rely on some of our present release methods. The one that's pictured here is direct autumn release. And this is where we release these juvenile whooping cranes near adult whooping cranes right before they're about to leave on their migration. The birds will then kind of bring them into their flock and fly down with them in the fall and then bring them back up in the spring. So as you can see when talking about this whooping crane reintroduction process, it's incredibly time consuming, but it's also incredibly expensive as well. The cost for raising and releasing one whooping crane out into the wild and then monitoring them once they're out in the wild is about $100,000 per whooping crane that we have out there. So this year we saw the number of whooping cranes grow as a result of wild hatched, parent reared, and costume reared chicks. So in the wild, in our eastern migratory population, we had 14 eggs that hatched in Wisconsin, and 2 of those chicks that came from those eggs survived until fledging. Unfortunately, survival of wild hatched chicks is pretty low. It's just about 15% that survive to fledge, or to being able to sustain flight, because they do face so many natural threats in the wild, one of them being the many predators that they face. But this year, to help the population grow, we also released 4 whooping cranes into the eastern migratory population and an additional 5 into our Louisiana population. As you can see also by looking at this graph here, the population's growth has slowed in recent years. So that's going to be that thin black line is the total number of individuals. We've also seen that mortalities here in red has started to outnumber releases in wild fledges, and those are going to be pictured in green. And this is really largely due to us prioritizing growing that non-migratory Louisiana flock in recent years and releasing many of our birds that we've raised at the International Crane Foundation down there. But it's also a result of COVID-19 restricting some of our costume rearing efforts we were able to do at our site. As you can see from 2020 and 2021, there were little to no releases out into the wild populations. We are hopeful though that we will see that graph turn up again and growth will continue in our eastern migratory population. Now, once we release these birds out into the wild, or even if they're wild hatched, it's important that we continue to monitor this wild population. There are a relatively young population, first started in 2001, and knowing that they are so long-lived and slow to reproduce, it's going to take us many, many years of data to understand really what the long-term survival of this population is going to look like. So it's important that we monitor all of the individuals in this population. So all birds that are released into the eastern migratory population, and many of our wild hatched chicks as well, are going to have these colorful bands on their legs. So in our eastern migratory population, that's going to be some combination of white, green, red, and black. And many of them are also going to have radio transmitters as well. And that's that thing that kind of looks like a stick hanging off of this whooping crane's leg right here. So our team of scientists at the International Crane Foundation, as well as volunteers along the flyway, they track our birds and they use this information to essentially further research and knowledge about whooping cranes. We also rely very heavily on reported sightings from the public or from citizen scientists along the whooping crane's flyway. And I want to show you where whooping cranes can be spotted in Iowa, especially noting in your region too. So whooping cranes in the eastern migratory population, they've been spotted in 14 Iowa counties since their reintroduction in 2001. And as you can see from looking at this map here, we are seeing the majority of our sightings for our eastern population are going to be along eastern Iowa, right along the Mississippi River right there. And these sightings are most often occurring again during migration. The counties that are served by the Prairie Rapids Audubon Society are just on the kind of western edge of this cluster of whooping crane sightings. But you can see right here that in Bremer County, they have had whooping crane sightings, and the most recent reported whooping crane sighting was actually in 2017. We also know again from our sighting reports that the large majority of whooping cranes that travel through eastern Iowa are going to be those very young juveniles in their first year of life, which then shows again that importance of knowing not just what adult whooping cranes look like, but what those juveniles look like, as those are the ones you are much more likely to encounter in your area too. So we ask that if you do spot a whooping crane in Iowa, to look for those colorful bands on their legs. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to see where these birds are at, because again, this information is incredibly important for us understanding what this population is doing, what their survival looks like, what are some of those habitat decisions they're making, or those migratory pathways that they're creating. So the first step to reporting a banded whooping crane to the International Crane Foundation is to confirm that you saw a whooping crane. And again, you can use the first part of my presentation to do that for both the adults and the juveniles. The next thing you can do is check if there are whooping cranes reported in your area. You can do that by heading to whoopermap.savingcranes.org, and it takes you to this landing page right here. And this will show you all of the counties that whooping cranes have recently been reported in. So you can see if others have reported that whooping crane sighting, or if you might be the first. And then finally, you can report your sighting at bandedcranes.org or click report a banded whooping crane. And here we ask you to share with us the exact location that you saw that bird. If you have a picture, that's very helpful as well. If you saw the colorful bands on their legs and you can report that back to us, even if you saw just one leg, it really helps us to narrow down who that individual might be and any other unique information you have about your whooping crane sighting. We do ask though that after you share your sighting with us, you don't share that very specific location information with your friends, family, or on social media. They are an endangered species and they are very sensitive to disturbance. And the International Crane Foundation is only sharing out the county that they're seen in. So we ask if you share anything, it's nothing more specific than the county where you spotted those birds, so we can make sure that we're keeping them safe from any sort of unnecessary harassment or disturbance. But today, across all of the wild and captive flocks of whooping cranes, there are about 800 birds. And you can see in our eastern migratory population, it sits at around 76 today. So in just about 70 years, we've really seen a significant recovery of the species. And this story is really proof that by working together, scientists, governments, and communities can save a species from the brink of extinction. Our work, however, is not done, as whooping cranes in the eastern migratory population are continuing to face threats due to various factors, the first of which is going to be habitat loss. So our whooping cranes are threatened by urban expansion and land conversion for agriculture, and they're also threatened by increasing development near the wetlands they roost in at night. Whooping cranes also continue to be threatened by collisions with power lines, more so in the areas where they're coming down to roost at night. So these birds are going to be coming down when it's lower light, they're going to be flying closer to the ground. They're a little bit less observant, they're more tired, and this is when they run the risk of colliding with power lines. And then finally, one of the big threats that I work with is the threat of the illegal poaching of whooping cranes. So as an organization that's working to reintroduce whooping cranes to the North American landscape, ensure that they're kept safe in the spaces that they are in, we want to understand a few things. We want to know where poaching is happening, who is causing it, and why is it happening, and what can we do to stop it. So you can see from this map here where all whooping crane poaching incidents have occurred. All the darker states are the states where whooping cranes have been spotted in, and you can see here that poaching incidents are occurring across their entire flyway, with the greatest concentration in their wintering habitats. Next question then is, who is causing this? What we found is that ultimately the majority of these poaching incidents are not caused by hunters or cases of mistaken identification. More often than not, it's caused by people who are already committing illegal activities, such as shooting game wildlife out of season or shooting non-game wildlife for the sport of it, or they might even be trespassing or committing some sort of crime at the same time. So the question then becomes, how do we stop the poaching of whooping cranes? And ultimately, we're doing that through situational crime prevention. So in 2015, the International Crane Foundation attended a workshop that used situational crime prevention to address wildlife crimes, which in our case is again poaching. And this theory states that wildlife crime occurs when these three scenarios align. You need an attractive target, that's going to be our whooping crane, a motivated offender, that would be a poacher, and then a lack of guardianship. And this lack of guardianship is key. When you think about birds that are oftentimes protected in the public eye, you might think of a bird like the bald eagle. This is a bird that everybody knows about. They know what they look like. They know that they're important to communities and to our country, and they know that you can get into a lot of trouble for harming bald eagles. So if we can create that sort of guardianship for whooping cranes, we can help to ensure that they're kept safe in the spaces that they're using it. We found that if communities don't know about or care about having cranes on their landscape, they're less likely to protect them or advocate for them. But if we can flip that around, we can protect whooping cranes in the long term. So what the International Crane Foundation has been doing is been working diligently to address this issue of illegal poaching of whooping cranes through creating a pride and awareness for whooping cranes through community outreach programs with K through 12 students. Unfortunately, the average age of a poacher is just 26 years old. We've also been working very closely with outdoor recreationists, birders such as yourselves, hunters, and more across this whooping crane flyway since 2015. And we're working with these communities to ultimately share with them the story of whooping cranes, the threats that they face, and ask them to be advocates for whooping cranes by spreading our message and inspiring others to care for whooping cranes and be our eyes and ears on the ground for reporting the poaching and harassment of whooping cranes. So since 2015, we've seen whooping crane poaching drop from causing around 16% of adult mortalities to around 10.5%. And our goal is to completely eradicate this as a cause of mortality for whooping cranes. So following all of this, you may be wondering, well, what can I do to help whooping cranes? And fortunately, there are many things that you can do to help whooping cranes. The first being, know how to identify whooping cranes and safely look for them on the landscape. So in safely looking for whooping cranes, we ask you remember to give them their space and stay at least 200 yards or 2 football fields away from them at all times. So that means you will need to bring your optics out into the field. We ask you to stay on the trail, park in designated parking areas, and respect private property. We want to make sure that we're not introducing these birds to any sort of unnecessary disturbance or harassment. And if you spot whooping cranes, look for those bands on their legs, report it to bandedcranes.org. If you see any sort of poaching or harassment of cranes, please contact local authorities. In Iowa, the poaching hotline is 1-800-532-2020. Another way you can protect whooping cranes is by talking to your friends and legislators about cranes and wetlands in your state. And then finally, you can head to our website, savingcranes.org, to learn a little bit more about the International Crane Foundation and the work we're doing to protect whooping cranes. You can also learn a little bit more about our site in Baraboo, Wisconsin. We do operate as a zoo as well, so you are welcome to come visit us between May through October, where we're open every day of the week from about 9 to 5. You can see all 15 species of cranes on exhibit, but on our website, you can also learn a little bit more about the work we're doing. You can sign our pledge to protect whooping cranes, which just keeps you in the loop about some of the work that we're doing and signs you up for our e-news. And I can drop that link in the chat as well. And finally, you can get involved in the Midwest Crane Count. So this is an annual crane count, lasts about 2 hours in the morning in April, and you can count as many cranes as you see, report this to the International Crane Foundation, gives us an idea of where the cranes are at and what their numbers are looking like. So I looked up your Iowa counties to see which ones have been involved in the Sandhill Crane or the Midwest Crane Count in the past. And it looks like in Bremer County, it was involved last year and they counted 62 Sandhill cranes. So if you are interested in the upcoming Midwest Crane Count, it will be on April 15th this year from 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning. And I can also drop that link in the chat as well. All right, I do want to open it up to any questions you might have for me. And I want to thank you guys again for bringing me here to talk a little bit about whooping cranes and some of the work that we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, okay. Great. Wow, wonderful presentation. I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of questions. You can put them in the chat or ask as we go along. I have a number of questions. One comment first about poaching that I learned. I called the DNR anti-poaching site, and it wasn't working for 2 days.
Mm.
And so I called the sheriff department, and they told me that if I ever had that problem again with any kind of poaching, that I could call the sheriff's office. And since it's a crime in progress, you can call 911 and they will connect you with the nearest game warden or whoever needs to be contacted if you can't get that. So it's a bit of information. My one question I have is with pesticides. I was just reading about that from American Bird Conservancy about a pesticide that was approved by the EPA even after a lawsuit. It's called Imperfluxum, I think. It's a seed coat on a pesticide seed coating, I guess. And it claims to be harmful for whooping cranes and other birds, that they can go and ingest a number of these seeds that are maybe in a field, even though whooping cranes are opportunistic, I guess. Do you have experience with that with chemicals?
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak to that a little bit. So I have seen, I believe, the article that you're talking about with seed coating and potentially chemicals impacting our whooping cranes or our sandhill cranes. And I can say that we have done studies with sandhill cranes on seed coating and some of those pesticides as well. And we have not seen lethal effects for our cranes from these seed coatings. That's not to say that there aren't sublethal effects occurring, maybe impacting their organs or some other factors that might be at play. Those aren't things that we have studied or have a definitive answer on, but we can say that we aren't seeing lethal effects as a result of this pesticide use at this time.
I see some questions in the chat. Candace, you want to handle that or want me to do that?
So David asks, are we seeing more bluebirds in the survey in the past? Which I think is a question for later and not necessarily right now. So we can address that. So Ken asks, has the avian flu been an issue at the International Crane Foundation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were prepared to deal with the avian flu as we have seen it impacting the Midwest. And one of the things that we have noticed is that cranes, being as territorial as they are incredible at keeping waterfowl out of their ponds. So one of the big carriers that we worried about with our cranes was inhabiting some of those spaces that waterfowl are using at the International Crane Foundation, because we do have large ponds for our birds to use. We did keep our birds off exhibit during migration time to make sure that we weren't introducing them to any instances of waterfowl or some of those dead birds in their ponds to introduce them to avian flu. And we didn't see any outbreaks of avian flu at our site at the International Crane Foundation. When we spread that out a little bit to Wisconsin as a whole, we also did not see cases of widespread avian flu among the crane community as well, especially with the whooping cranes we were working with. We weren't seeing that either. When we spread it out to the international scope and we think about some of those birds out in Asia, where we have some large feeding stations that have been set up to help those birds congregate, we do see avian flu in those instances. So if we have some of those large feeding congregations of cranes, we can see avian flu spread very quickly, but we don't have that going on at the International Crane Foundation or in the breeding areas in the Midwest. We are seeing it in other countries though.
I'm curious about the process of a crane eating a crab.
It's usually poking a hole in it and then kind of digging around and getting everything out. But I have seen some very impressive videos and pictures of cranes eating some things that you think maybe they shouldn't be able to eat, such as a large catfish. They've been able to get one down. But my favorite picture that I've seen comes from our friends that we have in Louisiana, where we actually have a whooping crane that ate a cottonmouth, obviously crushed its head first and then ate it, but not something that you expect to see, you know, one of the rarest and most endangered birds doing, taking on a very venomous snake.
All right, another question from David. With Easter numbers being so low, are there any problems with pairs forming? Do the males find the females?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So as far as my knowledge is, we do not have issues of pairs forming. And a lot of that is a result of us continuing to use the same release areas. So we release our birds at Horicon National Wildlife Refuge, Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, and White River Marsh. And by continuing to release those birds in the same spot and them having pretty high site fidelity, we're keeping the concentration of whooping cranes in those areas. And when we're releasing our birds, let's say we have a lot of females coming out one year, we want to put that in an area where we have a lot of single males too. And we know that they're going to continue to all return to that same site year after year.
I have a question about banding. We used to help band trumpeter swans back when they're being reintroduced. And they put the band, when they sexed them, the young ones, they put the band on the right leg of a female because they said, because the female is always right. And, or usually they'll put the female on the left side. What is it with trumpeter swans? Can you tell which leg the main band is on, the silver band, sex? And then also, do those radio transmitters, are they picked up on Modus towers?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I'm not out in the field, I can't say for our wild birds if the silver bands are placed based on sex, but I will say our birds in captivity at the International Crane Foundation, it is placed like that. We do ladies on the left and guys on the right. I don't know if we're doing that with our wild population, though. I can't quite answer that. And then for our radio transmitters, we typically use the GPS transmitters, or we use ones that you have to manually track using the Yagi antenna. So this time we're not using Modus, but Modus is very cool. So it would be exciting to get whooping cranes on the Modus network too.
We have another question. How do you avoid inbreeding when artificial breeding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually outsource some of that work to the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. So they have geneticists on their staff. So we take genetics of all of our birds, we send it out to them, and they send us back a breeding recommendation of who should breed with who to introduce the most diversity into the population. And we just follow their breeding recommendations so we can introduce more of that diversity and again, have those healthy populations. They also, to add to that, they do give us breeding recommendations too on which combinations should be released out into the wild and which ones should be held back as a genetic holdback for birds that are going to be increasingly genetically valuable and we want to have on our flock so they can have the best genetics then to pass on as well too. So a lot of that comes from just some very smart geneticists that tell us who should breed with who.
What is the evolutionary history of cranes?
Oh, I think you might have stumped me there. I'm not quite sure.
I saw a number of years ago a sandhill crane I took photos of in the end of February over at Cereal Sand Prairie, because I believe they've been nesting over there just a few miles outside of town. But this crane that flew over had its legs tucked, which I've never seen before. Is there a reason for a crane to do that?
Yeah, I've seen cranes kind of tuck their legs either when they're getting ready to land. So with those long spindly legs, it makes it a little bit hard to touch down. So sometimes they might tuck their legs so they can kind of get a center of gravity before they touch down, or they might do it right when they take off. It might kind of curl up and then bring its way back out. I have also heard of people spotting it, and the assumption is that maybe the birds were cold when they were flying, but those are the only few instances I can think of. It's not quite common.
Another question. I've been kind of dominating this year, but is there any instance of like melanistic or leucistic cranes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have had, for whooping cranes, I do not know of any of that within the eastern migratory population. There could be in our Aransas wood buffalo one. Unfortunately, we don't have as much of a close eye on them. Only about 10% of those birds are banded, whereas we have in our reintroduced populations about 100%. So we have a much closer eye on what's going on. But when we talk about sandhill cranes, we've definitely seen our melanistic and leucistic sandhill cranes as well.
We have another question in the chat. Anne asks, how did the scientists come up with the idea for the cranes to follow the small plane for migration?
That is a great question. And while I would like to say it was just genius and we thought of it on our own, somebody else did it first with waterfowl. I believe they were reintroducing Canada geese. Or no, I'm sorry. I think it might have been tundra swans. It was one of those. They did it with waterfowl first, though, and it worked incredibly well. And we learned from their methods, so we copied it.
So
Oh,
I
we-
have a question. I have a question. So not all birds get the actual transmitter, do they? How do you decide which birds get that transmitter? And do you have any data that indicates morbidity rates on birds that have the transmitters rather than just the leg bands?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't see any higher morbidity with our birds with the transmitters on them. And that does seem a little bit shocking given how kind of big they are and that big piece kind of hanging off of them. But we find that they can tuck it in pretty well underneath them and it doesn't become kind of a hazard when they're moving around. For deciding who's going to get the transmitters, sometimes it's based on just survival, which ones we think are more likely to survive, which ones we think are more likely to breed. If maybe they are a chick that's within a pair that's going to an area we don't know much about, we might put it on that bird so we can learn where those parents have been spending their winter months. It really kind of depends on what sort of questions we're trying to answer.
And how long is it? I noticed the one chart where it had kind of the, what was it, like long-term missing birds.
Mm-hmm.
So there was an injured whooping crane that I spotted right along the Mississippi River, and we reported it. And so Ann Lacey was part of that conversation, and then Billy Ryder Malruff with the National Game and Fish kind of kept an eye on it. And her number was 1711. And it turned out that that bird, to my knowledge, was never relocated after she left that area, nor were her remains ever found. And I always felt this connection to this bird. And so I would really like to know if perhaps you have, somebody could tell me more details.
Yeah, so about 1711 in specific?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have on our website, we actually have crane bios for each of the birds in the eastern migratory population. And I have your email, so I can email that to you later, so you can learn a little bit about 1711's story. But if you go to our website, Saving Cranes, you can look up whooping crane biographies. It goes by class, so the year that they were hatched, and it has information about each individual. So if they were raised in captivity, it has their number as well as their kind of chick name while they were at our sites. They have cute little names, who their parents are. You can find out a bit about their parents, and you can see which areas they're using each year and see even which individuals are making their way through Iowa too.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have another question. Of all the adult cranes at the ICF, are some more dangerous to work with than others?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say all cranes are pretty dangerous to work with, given that they're so tall and you're about nose to beak with some of them. When it comes down to species, I would say personally, I think the Siberian cranes are probably one of the most territorial and defensive. They're actually the only ones that have serrations on their beak too. So their bite can definitely pack a punch. But really it comes down to individuals and their demeanor. That being said, again, all cranes are pretty dangerous. So when we ask people to stay at least 200 yards away to give these birds their space, it is definitely for your safety as well, because they are very territorial. They do fight and they do something called a jump rake, where they take their feet up to about eyeball height and then they pull their feet down in sort of a jumping and a kick. So they're all pretty dangerous birds kind of all the time, but for individuals, it comes down to which birds maybe just a little bit more temperamental or a little bit more territorial than others.
I missed it. Well, you've said it, but I don't remember. How many wild cranes are out there were hatched in the wild?
Oh, hatched in the wild. I would have to look that up because we have a lot of them that hatch in the wild, but we do face really high levels of mortality in the population. Again, about 15% survive to fledging. And then on top of that, the first few years of your life, as you know, with birds, your survival gets higher with each year as you know what you're doing a little bit more. But that first migration and then the spring migration back, very high mortality in that time. So while there's about 80 birds in the population right now, there have definitely been more that have hatched in the wild and more that have hatched in captivity. I'd have to look deep into our data to get a specific number about how many total we've had hatch in the wild. But this year alone, we had 14 that hatched and 2 that survived.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, we're hoping maybe to do a field trip out there sometime. It's about a 3-hour drive from our Waterloo area to Necedah, Baraboo, and that area. Necedah is a great place to go. And so if we come, is the Crane Foundation open every day of the week? And is there a better time to come to try to see the whooping cranes at Necedah and in the wild than others?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So the International Crane Foundation is open from May 1st through October 31st. And we are open from 9 to 5 every single day. I would say the best time to visit the cranes, both at the International Crane Foundation and during migration, or at Necedah, sorry, at International Crane Foundation or at Necedah is going to be during migration, specifically fall migration. So I think the best time to see these birds is truthfully September each year. So coming to our site, it's going to be the most mild temperature. You're going to be just outside of the big draws of people that come to the Crane Foundation. We are one exit before the Wisconsin Dells, which is a big summer touristy spot. So it can get loud, it can get busy. So I like September the best. But then when it comes to seeing the birds out in the wild, if you come during the summer, our birds are going to be sitting out on nests at Necedah. So there's going to be one bird that's going to be hidden pretty well, and the other one will be off the nest at that time. But when they're foraging, they keep a pretty low profile. So it can be pretty hard to see them during the summer. But then in the fall, you're going to have the 2 adults that were just nesting, and you'll have that 5-foot tall juvenile as well with them. So it's just much easier to spot them. And I always think it's pretty exciting to see the chicks too.
Good. Thank you.
Of course.
Go ahead. Do we have any other questions from anybody here? Speak up or. Hearing none, we'll thank you, Stephanie. It was just a wonderful, informative program, thoroughly enjoyable. And I hope we all, if you haven't seen a whooping crane, I hope you get a chance to do that sometimes. So thank you so much. And we'll hope to see everybody either in person next month or on Zoom if we can get that up and working. Just check our website and our emails and we'll keep you posted on that. So, all right. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Quite welcome. Thank you.
Very much.
So, David,